Hello, and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa, I'm your host, and today I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Dr. Allan Bacon. He's the owner of Maui Athletics, coach, mythbuster, and a contributor to the Allan Aragon Research Review. Welcome to the show, Allan.
Hey, Lisa, thanks for having me on.
Well, my absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to talk about lots of popular topics and have some myths busted, hopefully, as well. But before we do that, maybe you want to introduce yourself a little bit and just give our listeners a background and who you are, how you got to what you do today.
So, as Lisa said, I'm Dr. Allan Bacon. I am the founder and head coach at Maui Athletics, and it's a fitness and nutrition lifestyle coaching business to help the average working adult reach the physique and performance and health that they're trying to achieve. I kind of had a roundabout way into health and fitness. It was funny because I was doing dental surgery, and I practiced for 10 years, and my father ended up getting throat cancer. And one of the things that I spoke with him about when he was going through his battles was, if you could make a difference in what you had done in the past, what would you change, in how you had practiced? And he had mentioned that he had wished that he would have spent more time, with his family, with his friends, having a better quality of life. At the same time, it was December 24th, and I was doing emergency surgery at 8:30 p.m. And I was missing out on Christmas Eve dinner with my wife and in-laws. And it was a situation where I kind of had all these things, hitting at once, and was reviewing it in my mind. And my wife had always been into fitness. I had always been into fitness. And I spoke with her about it. And I said, hey, what would you think about having a fitness and nutrition company on the side? And she was very positive about it. So we started Maui Athletics, and it took off. And then the career eventually transitioned into essentially coaching and teaching people online full time. And it's been very rewarding ever since.
Super cool. Quick question. Are you located in Hawaii, or how come the name Maui?
I actually live in Maui.
Oh, okay, you do
And
live in
so,
Hawaii. Okay, I was like,
yep. And so,
I don't know. I didn't look that up beforehand, but that makes absolute sense.
yeah, so for me, it's 6 a.m.
Okay, perfect. Well, that works out
Yeah.
well. I'm glad you look so bright and talk so well at 6 a.m. That's great.
Well, I thought that starting my day off with the podcast would be a good positive note. It's always fun to get in and speak with other professionals in the space, and particularly people that like yourself, that are trying to do things in the proper manner, get really good information out there. And I think that these discussions can really help a lot of people.
Amazing. Well, one thing that I would like to ask you is in regards to the article that you published in the Allan Aragon Research Review, which is where I first found you. And in this article, you basically said, or I think the article was titled something like claiming that the protein intake at about 1.6 grams per kg is actually I forgot the exact wording, but it is not giving it justice, or it's not taking context in consideration, so to speak, and just having that as the recommendation is which is floating around the space at the moment is misleading. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because a lot of people say, okay, 1 gram per pound, so that would roughly be 2.2 grams per kg, but now in more recent studies or whatever, they were saying, 1.6 is the absolute maximum, or you don't need more. So I'm glad that you shown a different light on that.
So, for the people that had checked this out, Allan Aragon and I had done a review on the breadth of the research. And there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, a general recommendation for the public is 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, you should shoot for 1.6 grams per kg body weight. These things are perfectly fine recommendations. The issue with this topic that both Allan and I found was that it sort of lacks nuance. And unfortunately, what a lot of fitness influencers were doing, or fitness professionals were doing, is that they were latching on to individual studies, and they were saying, hey, look, this is the amount of protein that you need, and you don't need any more. And that's the end of the conversation. And unfortunately, if you actually look at the breadth of research, there's a variety of situations where taking in more protein than that may make sense, both from a physique standpoint, a sustainability of a diet standpoint, and potentially a preference standpoint. And there doesn't necessarily seem to be anything wrong with going higher. Now, having that baseline of we should shoot for 1.6 grams per kg is actually a good recommendation. That's where we see if you're trying to maximize lean muscle building, particularly in a calorie surplus. That's a great recommendation. However, when you look at the breadth of research, the greater intakes seem to be associated in many cases with better body composition, potentially better satiety when you're eating. Um, excuse me. Potentially better sustainability for some people, because when you have that increased satiety, when you have that ability to stave off those hunger cues and those craving cues, it can make things a little bit easier. And even when you look at professional bodybuilders, if you look at the top 5 placing bodybuilders in competitions, they tend to have significantly higher protein intakes than what we see at this 1.6 grams per kg recommendation. Now, it's potential that these higher intakes are there because maybe they are successful despite what they do. Maybe they're just getting the minimum and they're going over, and that's okay because a higher protein intake doesn't necessarily add significantly to body fat accretion or body fat deposition. And so in these physique sports, maybe they're getting some extra calories in when they're in these very deep cuts. And it could be helping them for multiple reasons. It could be preventing larger amounts of muscle protein breakdown, which was really beneficial in these physique competitions. It could be allowing them to intake more calories and importantly, a higher volume of food without negatively impacting their physiques. And so for these people that are out there that are really trying to get, ultimate beach ready or stage ready, maybe these higher intakes make a lot more sense, particularly in a calorie deficit, and particularly the more extreme our calorie deficits go. And even with general population people, these deficits tend to be significant when you're going into things like, a beach vacation or a wedding or an important event. And then these lower intakes in the optimal range, the 1.6 grams per kg, may not be optimal for these people for body composition or for the goals that they have as far as sustainability goes. So there is nuance in this. And the leaner that you are, the more significant of a calorie deficit, the greater goals that you have for body composition. Maybe these things raise that recommendation level of where we should be taking our daily protein intakes. And even if the current research is pointing towards this and later we find out, hey, maybe it's not. So I use things in grams per pound. So I'm going to say that just unfortunately, but I don't want to throw everybody off. But, about 1.6 is maybe 0.72 to 0.8 grams per pound. If we're starting that as our baseline, my general recommendation is, depending on what you're doing, if you're in a deep cut, or if you have very high physique goals, maybe going up to about 1.5 grams per pound is feasible for some people if that's, one, sustainable, and two, you enjoy eating that way. And we see the benefits in the research, at least in a correlation sense, going significantly higher than that. I mean, we've seen benefits go up to 2 grams per pound, 4.4 grams per kilogram. And we still see benefits in these ranges. And yet, when we talk about it as a fitness professional sense, people will get stuck on that 0.72 or that 1.6 grams per kg. And it's almost like the conversation ends. And it's not that that's wrong. It's that there's more nuance to the situation. And I don't want people to feel that if this is an easier path for them, or if they find success going to 1 gram or 1.5 grams, that this is somehow wrong in what they're doing. Because as far as the research goes, and as far as we currently know, it doesn't appear to be wrong. In fact, we appear to have some indication that this might have some very real benefit to people that are trying to maximize their body composition.
Yeah, you touched on so many great points. For one, adherence, I think such a big point, because when it comes to dieting, we as coaches, we know that hunger and not adhering to the diet are two of the most detrimental factors when it comes to a longer diet in particular. And then the other thing I often think is not talked about is like, are we talking about optimal or are we talking about what can we get away with? And as you mentioned, like,
Yeah.
yes, we might be able to get away with 0.7 or 0.8 grams per pound. But if we're talking about optimization and then looking at studies by, I believe, like Jose Antonio or whatever,
Mhm.
they're like, I don't know, up to 4 grams or so per pound. We obviously don't need to go that high. But like when it comes to the thermic effect of food and all these things, and we see some potential benefits anyway, then why not err on the side of caution and
Mhm.
kind of go for those? And I think if we're on the lower side, we see that things like protein quality and perhaps even frequency, etc., become more important as opposed to when we're in those higher ranges. And it's like, okay, it's fine. Some of this is more plant-based protein, etc., might not be as bioavailable. So yeah, I think there's a lot of myths out there when it comes to protein. And what do you believe are some other protein misconceptions that people often speak to you about or that you see amongst your clients?
Well, I think the biggest thing, the number one, and I alluded to this when I was talking a little bit earlier, but when you are looking at protein intakes, people will always think, okay, well, when I'm in a build or in a bulk, I need to up my protein because I'm trying to build muscle. When in reality, the opposite is probably true. When you're in a calorie surplus, you probably require less protein than when you're in a cut. You probably require more protein in a cut because you've got less body fat during those periods, which is metabolically protective. It will help protect lean muscle mass stores. And when you're in a cut, you're much more likely or much more prone to have increased muscle protein breakdown. I mean, that's just the name of the game whenever you have a negative calorie deficit. And so calorie requirements probably go up as we have less calories in our diet. And so that 0.72 or the zero point 0.8, the 1.6 grams per kilogram, probably makes a lot of sense when you're trying to build. And so if I was going to give a recommendation for somebody that's say, okay, I don't care about adding a little bit of body fat because that's understandable when we're in a calorie surplus and we're trying to maximize our return for lean muscle building. Some body fat's going to come along with that, and that's okay. My recommendations for people would probably be zero point 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight in the calorie surplus. Those higher intakes of protein probably make the most sense if you're either hanging around maintenance and you're trying to have a body recomposition phase, you're trying to slowly lose body fat as you gain lean muscle. Those higher protein intakes are probably very beneficial in those situations. And then they're probably most beneficial when you're in a calorie deficit, and particularly when you're trying to maximize body composition. And this is a big thing that I don't think that people realize when we're looking at this research. When we have nutrition research, the majority of nutrition research out there is in normal weight people. It's not in people with what I mean, even myself as a hobbyist bodybuilder, I probably have what's considered by researchers a large amount of lean muscle mass. The more lean muscle mass that you have, conceivably, the higher the protein intake that you would need to maintain that muscle mass and prevent muscle protein breakdown when in a calorie deficit. Because if you've got less body fat and more lean muscle, your body's going to have to pull energy stores from somewhere. And so you can counterbalance that in a couple ways. You can keep your calorie intakes higher, which could conceivably slow your progress or stall your progress. Or you could institute more weight training, more sleep, and a higher protein intake to help prevent as much lean muscle loss as possible. And that's where some of these higher protein intakes probably make more sense. And it's harder to get a clear picture in this because we've got less data in the research that looks at people at the extreme end of having muscle mass, both male and female, and seeing what happens to them when they're in calorie deficits. And like you mentioned, Jose Antonio is a great resource for this as far as protein goes. And even in his research, in particular, where they look at athletes, this is where we're starting to see some of those higher protein intakes probably make more sense under certain situations.
Yeah, and I
And
think
so
sorry, go ahead.
just to reiterate, I mean, the biggest misconception that I think that people have is that protein for some reason becomes less important in these cuts when it's probably paramount of importance when body composition is the main goal.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I believe there's actually a new study coming out or has already come out. I'm not entirely sure by Eric Helms, where he was is looking specifically at protein intakes for very lean, resistance trained bodybuilders, which, as you mentioned, is not usually the normal subject in most studies, unfortunately. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that one.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, in regards to protein and just the importance when it comes to people that are resistance trained, I want to segue a little bit into the anabolic window because so is there such a thing as needing to eat that protein soon after your training session? Has that been debunked? Is it more about the carbs around the training? What's your take on this?
So this is a great question. This is a great question because this is still something that people talk about constantly. And there seems to be a lot of confusion out there because again, as fitness professionals, I think that we do a disservice a lot of times in painting things as black and white. And sometimes we do it because we want people to focus on what's really important. And if you want to talk about what's really important regarding nutrient timing, total daily intakes are far more important than anything else. And that's where we've had this pushback from the 90s where we had you had to get in protein within 30 minutes, bro, or you're going to lose all your gains. And so we've kind of had a polar shift. And previously, we had that whole idea that, okay, within 30 minutes, you have to have this protein. Otherwise, it's going to minimize the benefits that you get or negate them. And now we're kind of giving the message, it doesn't really matter as long as you get in your total daily intakes. Now, for the average person, that's probably a good message because it's largely true. It's not entirely true. It's largely true. For people that are trying to maximize body composition, there's more nuance to it because nutrient timing does matter. It doesn't matter as much as total intakes, but it does matter. And the thing with the anabolic window is rather than an anabolic window, it's probably an anabolic barn door. And it seems to be that if we're trying to be nitpicky, say we're somebody who is a physique athlete and we're bodybuilding, we're competing against the best in the world and they've got the best genetics, and the difference that's going to be my place between first and maybe 10th could be nutrient timing because it can eke out a few extra percent of progress. And over time, particularly if you're doing this professionally, that can be a significant amount. For the average person, it's not large enough to really matter. But the anabolic barn door is probably a 6 hour period or so, because that tends to be the anabolic response to a protein containing meal. MPS is massively elevated for about 3 hours, but the anabolic response lasts about 5 or 6 hours. And so the concept of nutrient timing becomes a little bit more nuanced when you're trying to eke out those last 2, 3, 4% that you can potentially get from nutrient timing. And within that 6 hour period, it depends on what's going on. And so if you get up after an overnight fast, you've slept 8 hours, you haven't been eating, it probably makes more sense to get a meal, a protein containing meal of 25 to 30 grams or more before you train or directly after you train, because essentially your amino acid pools are at a low. Now, if you train in the afternoon and you've had a couple meals throughout the day and they're a normal meal that a normal human would eat, so they're a mixed meal scenario. They've got carbs, they've got fats, they've got solid protein amounts. If you've had one of those meals with an adequate amount of protein, and we'll say 30 grams on average, if you've had that within a few hours of training, you probably have a couple hours after training where you can still get in another protein dose and maximize all the benefits that you're going to get. So it's dependent on the timing of the protein containing meals that you have in relation to when your training is. And I think that explanation can somewhat overwhelm new trainees, which is why as fitness professionals, if we're talking about sustainability, longevity, and just getting people focused on what they need to do, saying focus on your total daily intakes makes the most sense. Is it entirely true? No, it doesn't appear to be. And there's a lot of research, including a lot of Alan Aragon's research that he's put out that really points towards this. Him and Brad Schoenfeld have done some good stuff about about nutrient timing, but It does appear to have some nuance. And if you're really trying to gain the most benefits, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Take a protein shake within 30 minutes of training. As long as that fits within your total daily intakes, that's going to be perfectly fine. It's not going to hurt in any way. But that becomes more critical the farther away your training is from the meal prior. And I think that that's where people are missing the nuance.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense, especially when it comes to training fasted in the morning or so. But I like the hierarchy there and just pointing out to clients and also being specific in regards to who are we talking to here, and
Right.
just kind of layering it in the sense of total daily protein above all else. Where I do even with Gen Pop, where I even see the benefit in talking about a little bit of protein timing is especially in the morning when we break our fast, and making sure that there is plenty of protein included there as well, as opposed to just saying, hey, whenever, it doesn't matter if you eat 100 grams at dinner, 100 grams at dinner and barely anything in your lunch and breakfast, mostly for, like we spoke about earlier, satiation, but also blood sugar, etc., and all these things. And that's where I sometimes think it still makes sense trying to get them to spread it out somewhat evenly. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you at the moment.
I find a good
There
practice,
you
and
go.
what you're talking about here makes a lot of sense because I recommend that people spread out protein intake as well. There is a little benefit to spreading out protein to maximize muscle protein synthesis as far as, like I said, it lasts, the anabolic response is about 5 to 6 hours. So spreading out 2 or 3 meals in a cut, 3 or 4 meals in a build, 5 to 6 hours of your protein intake probably maximizes how long you're anabolic throughout a day. But even more important than that for Gen Pop, if you don't start getting used to eating protein in meals, it's going to be very difficult to get in the proper amounts of protein in your day. And I'm sure that you find this with your clients all the time. When you get a new client, particularly a new client that has not led a gym life for the past 10 or 20 years, they're almost never eating close to enough protein. And so, one, the person's going to have to get used to meals that actually prioritize protein. And it's easiest to do that if you spread it out, because if you're going to have a meal at the end of the day that has 100 grams of protein, that's going to be overwhelming. It's going to be overwhelming both in size, and it's going to be overwhelming with the meal composition that you have. It's just going to taste kind of weird, because whenever you start to get people used to eating more protein, they're like, man, I'm used to my entire meals being like a plate of pasta and that's it. And so it does take time for a person's palate to change. It takes time for those habits to change. And the recommendation that you gave of spreading the protein out, I think is a wonderful thing to do, because at least anecdotally, it provides a much greater chance for success for clients. I mean, I've been doing this for years, and I find that it makes a huge difference in how well people do. And it makes their life a lot easier, because by the end of the day, they're like, oh, okay, I'm only short 20 grams of protein as opposed to I'm short 60 grams of protein. And now this is going to be a real pain in the ass to eat this meal.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. Why don't we continue talking about meal frequency? Because I think that that's another point where we can perhaps bust some myths, or or just generally enlighten the listeners a little bit. There are so many different things again thrown around. In the past, it was, you need to eat 6 meals or more or whatever. And then as of recent, oh, 1 meal a day, it doesn't matter as long as your total daily protein or
Hmm.
calories are equated for, etc. So, what do you like to, or how do you like to approach that with your clients, and what does the research say around this?
So what I had just mentioned, we started into that conversation. So this is a good transition. So if somebody's cutting at least 2 to 3 meals per day, and at least 30 grams of protein at each one of those meals to maximize that anabolic response. If you're building 3 to 4 meals plus to maximize that anabolic response. Now, there's a difference in the conversation. This is cool because there's nuance here as well. There's a difference in the conversation. If the conversation is, are we trying to maximize body composition, which means building as much lean muscle as possible, versus are we only talking about losing body fat? because they're different conversations. When you're talking about maximizing lean muscle mass, you have to take into account the anabolic response for meals, the muscle protein synthesis, the anabolic response that lasts 5 to 6 hours, the muscle protein synthesis that lasts 2 to 3 hours. If we're taking that into account, this is where we're really getting into the weeds, which is why sometimes having a nutritionist or a dietitian help you makes a lot of sense because you cut through this. Eating high protein meals, 30 grams of protein or more, shorter than every 2 to 3 hours or so, is probably not as beneficial as we once thought. So that cuts out the let's eat like 10 meals a day because you have a fully maximized muscle protein synthesis response for that time anyway. So adding in more protein is probably not going to stimulate that response any farther. So outside of every 3 hours or so, if you want to maximize the response, that's a great interval that you can, but you don't necessarily have to eat every 3 hours as long as you're getting in those 3 to 4 plus meals per day to maximize that. Now, if the conversation is how many meals per day should I eat, and all I'm focused on is fat loss, that's where it becomes 2 or 3. I would never go 1 because you're going to have some issues with nutrient absorption, both macro and micronutrients, phytonutrients, zoonutrients, all those types of things. You should probably spread that out so your body doesn't, I mean, you'll just pass any stuff that you can't absorb, right? And so it gives you the ability to have a better muscle protein response. It gives you a better ability to absorb micronutrients. But if you look at the majority of research out there, literally every study except for one shows that number of meals per day does not make a difference in fat loss as long as protein and calories are equated. Now, the one study that shows a difference, it was IAO et al. That looked at that, and they're an extreme outlier, and the data in that study doesn't really make any sense. So if you get rid of that one study and look at literally every other study on nutrition and number of meals, meal frequency, for fat loss, it doesn't seem to matter. Now, you could do 1 meal per day for fat loss and have the same, similar at least, results in the short term as some of these higher frequency time periods. My concern is that because you're probably not utilizing an entire day's worth of protein optimally with 1 meal, over extended periods of time, you will probably see more muscle protein breakdown. You'll probably see more lean muscle loss in those periods. So you'll probably lose the same amount of weight over extended periods. You'll probably lose some more lean muscle. So if you at least do 2 to 3 meals per day, you're probably going to stave off a lot of that problem. And you're probably going to do yourself a benefit from a health perspective because you're going to be able to absorb probably more micronutrients by having at least 2 or 3 meals in a day. On top of the fact that it's probably easier to have 2 to 3 meals versus having 1 meal. And if you say, hey, look, I love having a large portion of my day be a fast, that's okay. I mean, that's what intermittent fasting is. And intermittent fasting, there's no real benefit from intermittent fasting beyond the calorie deficit that it creates. If you look at any study that looks at intermittent fasting and you, again, equate protein and calories, intermittent fasting and a continuous diet do the exact same thing. The difference is in how a person perceives it. And so if a person says, in the mornings, and this is how I am, so I can commiserate with these people. I don't want to eat a meal until like 10:30 or 11. Just naturally, I don't want to eat. So I'll wake up and I'll have a cup of coffee and I'll call it a day. And I'm completely fine until 10:30 or 11. If that's the way that you like to eat and your goal isn't getting as big as possible, but it's getting, leaner, building some lean muscle is certainly feasible, but it's focused more on health and potentially, maintaining or improving body composition by losing some body fat, then an intermittent fasting style routine works just fine, but it works by controlling your daily calorie intake. But even within an intermittent fasting traditional window, which is a 16-hour fast and an 8-hour eating window, you're going to have 2 or 3 meals. And so you can get those 2 or 3 meals in, be more satiated in that time period in the afternoon when you're not at work, you're not rushing around doing your errands for the day. You're able to sit down and have a meal and focus. And so mentally it's easier, and you can cut that whole need that you might have from social media where people are saying, oh, the best way to lose weight is to do 1 meal per day. You can be confident in saying, okay, well, that's probably not the best way. And maybe I can do something that's a little bit more sustainable for me, or at least a little bit easier on myself because it allows me to enjoy my meals a little bit more without feeling like I'm going to have to intake, 120 to like 200 grams of protein, depending on your size, in one sitting, which to me sounds absolutely awful. And I'm a 230-pound man.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely awful to me as well. And yeah, I think even though most people listening to this are probably not planning on stepping on stage anytime soon, I do hope that almost everyone is becoming aware of the importance of retaining lean body mass as we're in a weight loss phase, or just the benefits of retaining as much lean body mass as possible throughout this time. And so exactly for that purpose, I would also say, spreading it between at least 2 to 3 meals. And I think some of the more recent research also shows that if we train within that feeding window, so having a meal beforehand and then training within and then having a meal afterwards, 2 meals is still fine. So I would just say, if you train in the morning, and I have some clients that are in the UAE and Dubai and those kind of Arabian countries, so many of them practice or participate in Ramadan, and so they have these huge fasting days, and then sometimes they want to train in the morning but then don't eat until night. And that's really not ideal. Of course, that's just a short amount of time. So we make do with this one way or another. But generally speaking, if someone has the choice, I would always say, hey, if you are someone who loves intermittent fasting, you don't eat until lunch, maybe don't train at 6 a.m. I don't think that that's the best idea. Also, from a recovery perspective, more than anything, I do think that having some kind of meal within a couple of hours after your training, just in general, helps us sort of activate that parasympathetic nervous system. And then on the other side, where we were talking about really high meal frequency of like 10 meals, 8 meals, whatever. I think for most people, especially if you have a calorie allowance, maybe for someone with my size, that turns more into grazing all day long.
Yeah.
And that's not ideal for many reasons either. Like in terms of blood sugar regulation, you never feel truly satiated, and still you always want something. And yeah, I definitely don't recommend that. I do want most of my clients to have like proper meals and then maybe having a snack in between. So I don't mind, having 5 or 6 quote unquote meals if someone prefers that. But just generally, this half a protein bar here and half of this there, that's not great for nothing.
Yeah, there's probably nothing wrong with more meals if that's how you like to eat. But the caveat to that is don't feel like you have to have a bunch of meals to stoke the metabolic fire, because that doesn't
Right.
exist. You don't change your metabolism based on the number of meals that you eat. You might change how consistent and adherent you are to a diet based on personal preference. And some people might tell me, I don't argue with people about these types of things because it's entirely personal. And if you believe, no matter what you believe as far as meal numbers go, as long as you're getting those 2 meals in a cut, maybe 3 meals in a build, if you tell me, hey, Alan, if a client comes up to me and they say, hey, I do best off of 8 meals, I'll be like, okay, we'll program you 8 meals. Because it doesn't necessarily really matter, from a fat loss perspective, as long as it's something that they're willing to do for extended periods of time. And if that's how they like to eat, fine. But like you said, particularly for smaller people, if you're under like 170 pounds, your meals, your calories are going to start to come at a priority, which means for somebody who's my size at 230, I can fuck around a little bit more and be fine. A Snickers bar to me is not the same as a Snickers bar to you. 200 calories to me could be 5% of my daily intake, and it could be 20% of your daily intake. So these fun-sized people, these king-sized candy bars become a king-sized problem really quickly. And you have to be conscious of that fact. And I know that I've had a lot of couples that I've worked with before, and the woman in the couple will be 130 pounds and the guy will be 220, and she'll be like, well, he eats, 2 or 3 slices of pizza every week and he's fine. And if I eat a piece of pizza, like I'm up, a couple pounds. And it's like, well, one, it's probably water weight to begin with. But two, again, relative, that amount is a lot more for you. So if you eat 2 or 3 slices and he eats 2 or 3 slices, you've increased your relative calorie intake much, much higher. And so that's something to keep in mind whenever you're doing this type of thing is, It sucks, particularly for smaller women. And we can have empathy towards you, but it doesn't change that energy balance equation. We can have empathy, but we can't trick your body. We can't trick biology. So we have to do whatever we can to make it sustainable for you. And like you were pointing out, Lisa, if a 120 or 130-pound female says, I want to eat 6 or 7 meals, well, that might sound good in your head, and we can try it, but realize you're not stoking the metabolic fire. And what you may be doing is you may, for some people, be making yourself much more hungry than you need to. So if you need to drop down to 2 meals and that makes your life a lot easier, drop down to 2 meals. It's not going to affect your health. It's not going to affect your progress. And it's going to be much better for you for sustainability reasons. And so the cool thing about all this is, for the most part, the client has the can take the steering wheel on this and just say, I want this many meals. And it doesn't matter. It just, as long as we're within those guidelines that we talked about before, largely it doesn't matter. And that's a good thing. That's a good place to be because it gives you a lot of choice. And when it's your choice as a person, that makes it much more sustainable because you feel like you have feedback in the situation. And it probably feels a lot better for you because of either genetics or your beliefs or whatever it is. But, I mean, anybody that's worked with people long enough in nutrition knows that giving a person something that's, 90 or 95% perfect is better than giving something that's 100% perfect that they have this innate drive to like fight against.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that a lot, that initially a lot of people say, hey, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I don't, I don't want you to want to tell you what I want. But then after
4 weeks later.
yeah. After a while, they realize that autonomy actually means sustainability, or at least higher chances for sustainability.
Yeah,
I, I do want to shift a little bit into the training side a little bit more, and I saw
sure.
a great post that you put up just recently, and that was kind of like, most people are probably doing way too much volume. And I found that quite
Yeah.
interesting because I do see that a lot with many of my clients as well. So let's just say the average client or listener might be, 35 to 55-year-old woman, very active, highly stressed life, maybe family life. And on top of that, training 4 to 6 times a week and, just go, go, go type of thing. And then often we run into hormonal issues and here and there. And so most of them actually have a harder time taking a rest day, myself included.
Uh-huh.
I will 100% include myself into this too. Taking a rest day is harder than, if I were to say, hey, you need to train 7 days a week, they'd be like, okay, cool, let's do it. But if I say you need to rest for 3 or 4 days per week, they're like, oh no, what should I do with not necessarily what should I do with my time, but it's like, it's so in their routine. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm interested to hear, number one, why you said probably most people are doing too much, and then what would be a better approach, or what's a more successful approach for health, for maintaining muscle in a fat loss phase, and of course also for losing the fat.
So, I mean, training itself is not going to be your avenue to fat loss. And I think that that's something that people really need to understand to begin with, because even general training sessions, an hour of training for people is going to burn between 100 and maybe 250 calories, depending on the type of training that you're doing. Now, if you're running a marathon during that time period, it's going to be significantly higher. But what I'm talking about is actually weight training. So we don't lift weights to lose fat. We just don't. We lift weights because it builds lean muscle, which can secondarily help us lose fat because any pound of lean muscle burns about 10 calories at rest each day. It's metabolically protective. It gives you more metabolic flexibility. You're better able to handle glucose when you take it in. You've got better glucose control. It prevents injuries, particularly as we age. Bank as much lean muscle as you possibly can now, because later it just gets harder and harder as our ability to utilize protein goes down, as our anabolic response goes down. So training, don't use it for fat loss. Now that that's out of the way, one of the things that I talk about as far as volume goes is, first understand that I typically work with people that are either interested in improving their strength performance or their physique. And so I get a lot of people that train like bodybuilders train, and a lot of people train based on how we used to see programs written in things like Muscle and Fitness in the 90s and all that kind of stuff. That's just the kind of the typical trainee that is out there. The problem with those programs is they're written for people that are on massive amounts of steroids.
Mm.
And I don't think that the general population realizes this, and it's way too much volume for a natural athlete. And so if you look at the research surrounding maximizing lean muscle building in a natural athlete, it's about 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week.
Really? Yeah.
Now, you could knock out 10 sets of chest in two exercises or three exercises in a single workout. And for many people, that's going to feel like too little. I mean, I've had people that try to, get 30 sets in just one workout for one muscle group because they think, well, if I do more, it's going to grow better. Now, yes, higher volumes have been shown to have a little bit of a return, but after about 20 working sets per muscle group per week, and it's going to be dependent on your genetics, how you respond to things, but that's about where it is for most people, diminishing returns really kick in. So instead of getting these like really big returns for the amount of time you're putting in, you're getting very, very minuscule returns and you're spending tons of time. You're destroying your recovery. You're investing all this time in this where you probably should be spending it doing something else. Maybe this is time that you could be spent meal prepping. Maybe it's time you could be spent that could be spent doing something that actually causes you to really lose body fat. And if you want to do something that's relatively active that will actually help you lose body fat, I mean, get out and do some NEAT, that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, the walking around. And, NEAT levels between people have been shown to be between, if you're extremely sedentary, you could only be burning a few hundred calories per day. But in very, very active people, particularly people with things like agricultural jobs, you'll burn an extra 2,000 calories per day on top of your resting metabolic rate by just moving around. And so if we want to talk about losing body fat, the best thing that you can do is one, start to eat more whole foods, and then two, actively start to move around. Set aside an hour a day to walk. And it doesn't have to be all at once. Maybe you get up every hour at work and you walk around for 5 minutes. And that's how you make it sustainable. Maybe you walk 20 minutes in the morning, or maybe you walk 20 minutes after you work out. And then you spend 5 minutes every hour walking around. It's going to oxygenate your brain, so you're going to work more productively anyways, but it's also going to add into this neat activity that's going to get you where you want to be. So the training for hypertrophy and lean muscle building doesn't necessarily have to be as high as we had it, in our previous training modalities because of things that we had learned from the 90s and early 2000s, but you can also use that time more effectively to get where you want to go. Now, if you're a strength trainee, volume goes even lower, and you should probably not go higher than 15 sets in a single training session. Because if you're actually training to optimize strength progress, you're going to be lifting very heavy and you're going to be taxing yourself pretty significantly with compound lifts that are more recovery intensive and more fatigue inducing than some of the bodybuilding training where maybe you're going to start with a bench press, but then you're going to go on to like some flies or something like that. That's not necessarily as taxing. And so for strength trainees, 15 sets per day is probably where you should cap it because anything that you're doing after that is probably junk volume. And you're probably just putting hits on your recovery without actually progressing what you're trying to progress towards your goal. So yeah, I mean, people do in both strength purposes and in hypertrophy purposes probably lift way more than they should be doing. And if we're doing 10 to 20 sets as a goal per muscle group per week for hypertrophy, if that's our goal, we should probably limit, particularly the less experienced that you are, the number of sets per muscle group in a single training session. And what I mean by that is as you become more experienced with training, your body adapts, you can handle more volume. It's just like when you first start running, you can probably run a quarter of a mile and then you can run half a mile and then you can run them all at once. Training with weights works the same way. And so we can handle larger volumes at one period. So it's funny when you look at frequency for training when we're trying to improve body composition. If you look at more experienced trainees, they can do those old bro splits where you do arms Monday, chest Tuesday, back Wednesday, or whatever it is. When you look at a beginner, and maybe even into an intermediate. They can't do that because and have the same results as splitting up frequency. So if we have an entire arm day for a professional, splitting that volume up into 2 days, spaced for at least 48 hours apart for recovery, seems to give better results for beginners and intermediates. So what's a good rule of thumb for figuring out your frequency is no more than 10 sets, 10 working sets per muscle group in a given training session. After about 10 or 12, that's where fatigue starts to build up and you're probably not getting as good of a return as you once thought. So that's where you start to get into those splits like upper lower, or like maybe you'll do chest and biceps one day to allow you to hit your chest. You're going to get a little bit of tricep work anyway, so that counts as like a third or a half of a set for those if you really want to get technical. And then do biceps because your biceps are fresh at the end of a training session where you've just done 10 sets of chest to start. And then you do biceps, and then you do maybe legs the next day, and then you do back and triceps the day after, because now you've given your triceps and your biceps time to recover. So then when you do back and you get that secondary help from the biceps, that's fine. And then the triceps are fine. And then you take a day off and then you repeat the cycle or whatever it is. But that's why there is some art and nuance to putting these fitness training programs together, because you're balancing what you know about the client or the trainee. You're figuring out, okay, well, based on their experience level, based on what they tell me that they can do, based on how their body composition looks, because you can look at somebody and tell whether or not they've highly taxed if somebody's walking around with large amounts of lean muscle, you're like, okay, they can probably handle higher training volumes, at least to an extent, and probably recover a little bit better. So you look at all of this, you take this all into account, and then you say, okay, I want to build this plan. If this person has physique goals, we want to optimally hit within that 10 to 20 working sets range by the end of the week. And I'm looking at this person and they're an intermediate. So maybe I want to split the frequency up a little bit. And then I want to space those muscle groups apart to allow for maximal recovery between, so they actually get the best return from the effort that they're putting in. And this is a very roundabout way to get back to your original question. How do we get people to actually take rest days? Well, this is how. This is the explanation that gets you to do that. Because if you never give yourself a rest day and you're never giving the musculature the time to recover in between these training bouts, you're not giving your body the time to optimally adapt. So you're putting in more effort, but you're not getting as good of a return. So for those people that tell me I'm really stir crazy because I have to be active every day. Okay, well then save some of your cardio for that off day from weight training. Save NEAT, some more NEAT for that off day from weight training. Go for a hike, go walk around the mall. Do malls exist anymore? Go do these things that you can do that doesn't involve you. Resistance training heavily that musculature. Go for a light swim, go for a bike ride outside. These are the things that you do on those rest days. And that's why I like to call them active rest days. Now, if you get to these rest days and you're like, man, I'm following Allan's routine and he got me in the right intensity level and I feel a little beat down because we just started this new training. And when you just start new training, you're a little bit more prone to delayed onset muscle soreness and some of these things. Sure, rest a little bit that day. Stay a little bit active. Keep those, monitoring your step count's always a good thing, and keep those step counts up. But maybe you don't need to go on that bike ride. But you have the option to do that if it's a good thing for you mentally and emotionally.
I like that distinction. I do think that many of my clients anyway, and myself included, it is a good thing to learn to rest a bit more and to like embrace that discomfort of like perhaps going into a yoga session or to go into the sauna or like something that's where you
relaxing,
where you don't really do anything and you're like, oh, I should be doing stuff, but it's important to learn that, and I think many people fall into that category, and I think many people are going to be very surprised by that 10 to 15 sets per muscle group, because yes, that I do think many people way exceed that and then go into that zone of non-functional overreaching, as we like to call it, right? And so
Mhm.
yeah, that's super important to learn, or to make that distinction between beginner, intermediate, or where do you fall, in which category do you fall into. And I think an important thing to acknowledge also, and that's sometimes harder to acknowledge, is that certain times of our life are going to require different amounts of training. You can't expect that with 40 or mid and late 40s, you can tolerate the same training frequency and volume as you perhaps did in early 20s, when you didn't have a family, when you didn't have your job, etc., and so on. So we do need to take everything into consideration. I think that's sometimes really hard to do, because we think, oh, I used to do that and it was so great and I did so well on this program, and now I
So,
can't.
those types of things, it's interesting because it seems to be highly correlated with stress levels and sleep. If you're getting less sleep, if you're highly stressed, you might need to cut back because your recovery is probably going to take a hit. It's funny when people talk about, I used to train so much more in my 20s, and now, that I'm 40, I can't train as much. It's less about aging in those situations. Assuming stress and sleep and nutrition is the same, assuming all of this is taken care of, it's less about aging in those situations than it is about being detrained. And this is a point that I really want to emphasize, because I think that it's important for people to know. Just because you can't handle what you did in your 20s doesn't mean that it was because of the aging process. It's probably because you're detrained. Now, the important thing about understanding this is that if you continue training throughout life, if you continue, optimizing, lean muscle mass gain as best as possible, you see very, very small decrements in this recovery and training ability over time. It's much, much smaller than what people think. The problem is we hit our 30s, we hit our 40s, we start having kids, and then all of a sudden our training takes a back seat. And so then when we come back in, we think it's because we aged that we can't handle it. But for the most part, it's because we stopped training. And it's harder later in life to build more lean muscle. So it's harder to get back to where we were, if not impossible in some situations. So this is a call to action for the people listening, essentially, to say never stop exercising. I mean, even if you have kids, if you have to cut back to 2 to 3 days a week, that's perfectly fine. But it feels like you're being selfish, but this is the best selfish thing that you can do. Because if your kid grows up with you being an active individual, with you valuing health, with you giving them that example, that is one of the most priceless things that you can ever teach your kid. On top of the fact that not only are you going to be an example for that child, you're going to be around for potentially 10 or 20 years longer because of the health benefits that this provides. And lean muscle is the organ of longevity. It's going to provide you a much longer time with them. And not only is it going to provide you a much longer time with them, it's going to provide you a much longer time with them with a better quality of life. You're not going to be 70 years old and have problems walking up steps. You're not going to be 75 and break a hip from falling down. Having more lean muscle is the number one thing that prevents injuries, that lowers injury risk. And it's really funny because for anybody that's over, I would say 30 or 35, you probably grew up playing sports. And the number one thing that literally all of our middle school, high school coaches would tell us to do is to stretch to prevent injuries. And now the more that we look at the research, the more that we find that stretching probably doesn't prevent injuries. Literally every systemic review that has looked at stretching and injury prevention shows almost no effect. The number one thing that prevents injuries, building lean muscle. Strength training is the number one thing that will help you prevent injuries and will give you better quality of life and a longer life. So this is an extremely important thing. And aging doesn't have to be the death sentence that we all think it is. Lean muscle does not rapidly go away if you continue training, which is a wonderful thing to understand. Your metabolism, and this is going to make a lot of people angry, your metabolism does not start to slow until age 60. At age 60, your metabolism drops by, I think it's 0.1% every year as it moves on. And so it's a very small drop in metabolism, a resting metabolic rate. But the big difference that we all feel is as we get in our 30s and 40s, we're having kids, we stop moving around as much, we stop going out, our stress levels rise up, and as stress levels rise up, we eat more like an asshole than what we did before. It's a compilation of all these problems that lead to obesity, lead to sarcopenia, the loss of lean muscle mass as we age, that lead to osteoporosis and all these problems. We think that it's just aging when largely we have an entire control over this. And even with women going through menopause, if you look at the research on menopause, women who continue training and continue their proper nutrition and continue their sleep schedules will lose body fat, will maintain muscle the same as women prior to menopause. But that's not to say that going through menopause or having hormonal changes like women have throughout their cycle isn't an issue, because it's certainly a challenge that you face beyond what men face. Men don't face these challenges. So you're certainly facing a challenge that is understandable. But as long as you have the knowledge to realize, hey, it may be harder for me to get into the gym because I feel like crap, my stomach hurts, or I'm feeling super hot, or I've got brain fog and I can't focus. If you know that if you continue using those habits and routines that work in other time periods, that it's going to work for you, that is a weight off your shoulders, because all of a sudden you realize, okay, well, the effort that I put in is worth it. And unfortunately, women have been sold this thing that they're like broken either half of the month or at a certain time in life. And it's complete bullshit. And it's done by these people that are trying to sell you plans or trying to sell you solutions. Oh, take my supplement that will help you throughout menopause to fix your hormones. That's bullshit. If you have a hormone issue, go to a doctor who is skilled in it and get hormone replacement therapy. It's completely worth it if it's done correctly. Same with men. If you have a hormone issue, get hormone replacement therapy. Supplements are not your answer if you have hormone problems. So these people that are trying to sell you workout programs for people in menopause, or supplements for people in menopause, or diets for people in menopause, they're scamming you. And it is understandable that women fall for it, because if people will point out something that seems like a pain point to you, or seems like a challenge, or they amplify a problem beyond what it is, it's a problem. And it's a problem from an emotional aspect. It's a problem from a pain aspect because cramps are not fun. It's a problem from hot flashes. There are all these things that are very real problems that we can acknowledge. But saying you're broken and that things all of a sudden don't work is a lie. And so you can look at this objectively. And if anybody wants any of the information on any of the things that I've claimed, because I know that there have been some things that seem controversial, I have all the research to back this up. So certainly send me a DM on Instagram and I can get those to you. But this is one of those things that I think empowering people, whether it's a woman or whether it's the person that's trying to chase soreness in their training routine and they're doing a god awful amount of volume because they think if I'm not sore, then it's not working, which is total bullshit, by the way. Then you're going to be doing things that are either stalling your progress, causing you to quit, or slowing your progress beyond what it needs to be, and you're spending too much time doing stuff that's bullshit. If you're spending, an extra 2 hours a week working out where you could have been meal prepping or you could have been sleeping, and you only get 6 hours of sleep a night, well, this could make a huge difference in your results. And so, one of the biggest things that I like to get into whenever I do my content creation is this myth busting, because telling people the answer is still the proper nutrition that you think it is: lean proteins, fruits, veggies, whole grains, dairy, healthy fats, those types of things. That's still the answer. Well, my microbiome's messed up. Proper nutrition, sleep, training, stress relief. Well, I want to lose fat. Proper nutrition, training, sleep, stress relief. Well, I want to gain muscle. You will always go to these same things. And it's funny because if you look at the biggest accounts on social media, the people that have 1 million followers or more are typically the people you don't want to get information from. You don't want to get information from them because to get that large of a following, you generally have to spew bullshit. And the reason that works is because of how the social media algorithm works. If I were to tell people, proper training, nutrition, stress relief. People go, fine. And they just immediately scroll on. If I tell you, if you get in an ice bath, it's going to raise your dopamine levels 250%. Whether it does it or not, and that's a whole other conversation that can last an hour, it doesn't really work that way. But the fact that you say that will make people think, oh, there's a trick or there's a secret. And the reason that I haven't been successful is I haven't been doing that. I haven't been training to to cycle sync. I haven't been training in the way that a menopause person should train. I haven't been icing or like taking this rare herb. It's all bullshit. And it's all bullshit because if they put that up, they're not necessarily conspiracy theorists, but the person that's looking for the secret or the trick, because if there's a secret, it wasn't their fault that they didn't succeed in the past. And then there's something new and fun to try. It's novel. Those people will hit like because they're looking, there's a very large portion of people that look for secrets. They'll hit like. Then there'll be people like I used to be in the past, and they'll make a comment and they'll share the research and they'll be like, this is wrong, and here's why. Well, now this person that just spewed bullshit or was very hyperbolic about a claim just got twice as much interaction as I would get by saying nutrition, sleep, training, stress relief. If I say that, nobody comments because the person that already knows that goes, yeah, well, I mean, that's obvious. And then there's nobody that's going to argue against that. So the people that spew hyperbolic bullshit, they will always have the biggest followings because the conspiracy theorist people will like, comment, and share. The people that know that it's wrong will like, comment, and share. They'll share it to their own story and they'll be like, look at this bullshit. And this is why it's wrong. And so the way the social media is set up is very confusing for the average layperson that doesn't know how to read research or doesn't understand how to critically review information, because the common person thinks that follower count is a sign of credibility. And these same people are the people that get invited on to Good Morning America or get invited on to Joe Rogan or all these other things. They don't get invited on because they're credible. They get invited on because they've got something that people want to hear. It's the same thing. Trusting these people is the same thing as going to, remember the History Channel show Ancient Aliens? And they would talk about how aliens helped build like the pyramids. I could tell you who exactly built the pyramids, or you could watch Ancient Aliens and learn about the aliens that built the pyramids. People watch Ancient Aliens. You're getting your nutrition and fitness information from Ancient Aliens. And people don't realize that because these are the types of people that were invited on Good Morning America. I mean, the glucose goddess woman, if you look at the stuff that she puts out, literally 99% of it is wrong. And Allan and I have done debunkings. We actually did a trilogy where we did 3 of her videos in a row and debunked all of them with a large amount of research in those. And her entire platform is based off of misinterpretation of information with regards to glucose handling. And they're all wrong. But she was on Good Morning America saying this stuff. And the people in Good Morning America have no idea. They're not nutritionists. They're not dietitians. They're not nutrition researchers. They cannot vet this information. But they see that she has 1 million followers. And so maybe she's onto something. And we've never heard this before, and it's different. So Ancient Aliens was put on Good Morning America, and everybody went out and they bought a continuous glucose monitor. And this is an issue that some of these people have. And I think that really understanding what you're looking at here can really help. And if you want to be more critical about this type of information, you want to really understand, who should I listen to? It's very difficult, particularly if you don't have a science background, if you don't have a medical background, if you don't have a background in reading research. So the best thing that you can do, 1, ask them to provide research studies showing what they're claiming has some basis. That's number 1. More importantly than that, because they have to be able to explain why they think the way that they do. And you may not have a research study for everything, but if we're going to be taking some practical leaps, there should at least be a mechanistic background on why something could work. And so you can typically give those. Otherwise, you're just making shot in the dark. And if that's what you're doing, at least say it. The more important thing is, if it's a controversial topic, something like the ice baths and the dopamine, ask the person why they say that's wrong. The 250% dopamine release. Huberman came out and he said this: within 3 minutes of icing, you'll get a 250% dopamine release. 1, that's wrong. It doesn't happen. Two, the study that he based it on is Schrammick 2000. It took an hour of icing up to your neck, and they saw a 245% dopamine increase. Great. Ask the person who's saying that that's wrong to say, one, what is their belief? And then two, why is it wrong? And back up that with research as well. And again, anybody that wants to see this research, I can share it with them. That 250% increase in 3 minutes is blatantly wrong. In an hour, we're close to that. The problem with that is this ignores the other research in the space that shows that the more often that you ice, the more that stops. It eventually stops. So these people that buy ice tubs to constantly ice, you're not doing anything because after that initial icing, it no longer works. One, you're not sitting in there for an hour anyways. Two, we get diminishing returns. It stops working. Three, a 250% dopamine increase sounds really good, right? We can get higher than a 200% dopamine increase sitting still for 10 minutes. We can get higher than a 200% dopamine increase by biking for 10 minutes, by jogging for 10 minutes, by meditating for 10 minutes. These other practices that have benefits far beyond icing and significantly more benefits far beyond icing for 6 times as long. If I go and I jog for 10 minutes or bike for 10 minutes, I am getting this similar dopamine increase. It's like 240% versus 245%. That doesn't diminish the more often that I do it. It increases stroke volume. It improves cardiovascular health. All of these things, it improves cardiovascular performance. All of these things that icing does not do. And so we've been fed these lies through these podcasts because if someone was like, why don't you just go run for 10 minutes? Everyone's like, fuck you, that sounds terrible. I would rather sit in ice. And the funny thing about icing is it seems to be more of a thing for like the bro men that want to like feel like they're really strong. And you're like, well, how about you just go do like some high intensity training for 15 minutes? And they're like, no, that's tough. You're like, okay, but it has more returns in far less time. And then you could spend that extra 45 minutes meal prepping, which you're not doing as often as you should be anyways. And so, getting through this information that's out there is very difficult for the lay person because if someone just shows you that study on the dopamine increase, doesn't mention that it was only one session, doesn't mention that it was an hour long, doesn't mention that it was a tub up to the neck at, a certain temperature, you actually have to bring it down to a certain temperature. And I think it's in the 60s. Because if you go too low for an hour, you're actually going to give yourself frostbite. So that's probably not good. But it's like you're in a room and the entire room is the breadth of evidence and understanding of a topic. And these podcasters will come in and they'll have this tiny flashlight and they'll point at one little thing in the room and they'll be like, hey, look at this, then buy my training or watch my podcast because it gives me money when you watch my podcast. And they'll use the little flashlight. And then, somebody who's legitimately trying to give you information will walk in and they'll turn on the light to the entire room and they'll be like, but look at this. And you'll realize that one little thing that they were pointing their flashlight at didn't really matter because, whatever else is in the entire room is so much more grand. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea of we kind of know exactly what we need to do in many situations. Obviously, people aren't going to know, how many sets is perfect or how many meals do I need to eat. Well, you don't need to know that to start. And I think that that's a really powerful message too. You know that you should be eating more fruits and vegetables. You know that you should be eating more lean protein. You know that you should probably be eating a lot less processed food. Not that some processed food can't fit in a diet, but the reality is we're probably eating more than we probably should as a ratio in our daily intakes. Start with that. Start with walking. Start with weight training. And even if you don't know what you're doing, go in and screw around for a little bit. Do some bench press. Ask somebody in there to like help you out if they can. The funny thing about the more advanced people in the gym is they tend to be very happy to talk to you about training. The people that are going to be like annoyed that you're asking them questions are going to be those people that have only been training for like 1 or 2 years and they get really focused on their stuff. Assuming you're not asking a more advanced person something in the middle of their set, wait until they're done. Don't hover around them. They're typically very helpful and very happy to help you in those situations. Don't screw up their workout, but if you see some downtime or they're, hanging around afterwards and just talking to people, that's a good time period to like say, hey, look, I see that you know what you're doing. I would really love a little bit of feedback for this. And don't ask them every question that you have, but, take 5 minutes from them and then say thank you and then ask them another question another day. But, I mean, this can be a very overwhelming thing get started. The hardest thing in fitness and nutrition is taking that first step.
Mm.
And then it builds. Motivation builds upon action. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It gets bigger and bigger as you continue going. So do the little things that you can do, and a lot of things that we talked about. I mean, there's a lot of really good information in this podcast that we just hit on. But I mean, the biggest takeaway is do what you need to do to get started. And you're probably going to need some rest days. And so don't work out every single day, because particularly as a beginning trainee, you're gonna make your soreness a lot worse. You're gonna, really influence that recovery aspect. But, what do you need to do to take your first steps? And I think that if you ask yourself, what would a healthy person do in my situation? You'll give yourself at least 50% of the answer, if not more. Start to eat an apple at each meal. Do something that you can make a step towards where you want to go. And then when you're ready, look up somebody like Lisa, look up somebody like me, get a coach, and then move forward in confidence from there.
Amen to that first step. And I want to say amen in particular to what you said prior to that in terms of consistency as well. That is one of the things that I love to hone in on, in the sense of consistency. Like, even if it's 2 workouts a week, consistency, consistent, even if it is, 70-80% of your diet is really high quality, consistency with that, as opposed to those on and off, and I'm off my diet, but that's really the detriment, in my opinion. And the
Office
other,
called the weekends.
yeah, for many people, unfortunately, that extends into like 3 or 4 days, especially if we're
Yeah.
having like the 4th of July or so happening as well,
Yeah.
as we're recording this. But yeah, that it was like such a big point. And I just want to say you do a tremendous job busting those myths and really spreading some good information. So please, everyone, go and follow Allan. I'll put all your handles in the show notes, of course, and Maui Athletic website as well. So thank you so much for your time. This has been such a pleasure speaking with you. And yeah, if maybe you want to shout out your Instagram, even though I'm going to put it in the notes, but what's your Instagram handle?
Sure. First, you can go to mauiathletics.com. All of the links to my social media are on the footer, so you can slide down to the bottom and click on one of those. But for those looking just for the Instagram, it's Dr. Allan, Allan, Bacon. I always have to spell that out because my first name is spelled strangely with the double LAN. So Dr. Allan Bacon on Instagram, and certainly reach out if you have any questions or anything about the conversations that we talked about here.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it.